Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back, welcome back. Please take a seat as we will start our second plenary Sensemaking. Is it working? Oh yeah. Simone says, do the hand thing. Ah, look at this, beautiful. We all have a new trick in our facilitator toolbox to use from now on. Thank you for joining us for day 2. It's been a day full of more rich discussions, an amazing fireside conversation today in plenary, making sense of what came out yesterday, but also setting out some implications for the conversations that took place today. So again, the format of this session will be quite raw themes and patterns that are coming out straight from the sessions. Obviously, we had 2 types of sessions today. So on the one hand, we had the tracks, so the different sources of resilience and the different scales, so from people and households, communities, urban systems, socio-ecological systems, and market systems and value chains. But we also had a set of cross-cutting themes. So these are around health, around women's leadership and gender, around conflict, around sustainable poverty escapes, and also food systems. So what we will be doing is we'll be hearing back from our keynote listeners. Each set of sessions had its own keynote listener. So we'll do that in 2 parts. We'll hear from the tracks first and wrap up the track journey of this forum. Then we will do some discussions on our tables, and then we will go to the cross-cutting session. So we'll break it up a bit, but you will have some time to reflect and to discuss with the folks at your tables. So without further ado, can I invite the track keynote listeners for today? Join me. And I'm also introducing my timekeeping device, which is a singing bowl. So you've got 2.5 minutes. I thought it'd be nicer than me kind of going, psst, psst. I can also do that, but then we'll have a beautiful ding coming at the end of the 2.5 minutes. Sorry.
We all come up down?
This is tracks. You're in the next round.
Oh, that's what I thought.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. That's what I thought.
Yeah, all good. So track 1. Florence. Can we go to the next slide so you also have the names of our wonderful... Oh, next. Next. Sorry, maybe it was one back. It was the one with all the names. Just so we know who are the keynote listeners. Oh, apologies. So, over to you, Florence.
Yes. Should I start?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much, Corina. Thank you, colleagues. I did the keynote listening for the track on people and households. We had interesting discussions. It was organized like a debate where we had evidence producers and evidence users. And we had 3 main interesting presentations around measuring resilience. The first one that looked at high-frequency phone surveys and using lessons learned from COVID-19. We had interesting discussions. The presenter presented about how this kind of methodology was good in terms of collecting or producing knowledge, large-scale data at a relatively low cost, generating data around the impact of the pandemic or shocks and stressors, as well as looking at the short-term, long-term interventions to address or respond to the shocks. We also, had another presentation on recurrent monitoring systems and how these are good in terms of producing data on resilience dynamics, investments, as well as the design, and which inform the design and implementation of interventions to build resilience in households and in communities. And, then we had another presentation that was about using the Resilience Capacity Index to produce data or to generate information on impact evaluation, and with emphasis of using panel surveys. All of these presentations were making a case as to why, they are good or they are best. They are the best methodologies. And one of the things that came out clear was it was important that, resilience evidence is provided around knowledge, agriculture infrastructure, support to agricultural production, and also strengthening local organizations. The key observations, is that?
That is 2.5 minutes. You got 10 more seconds if you want. Key observations.
So key observations
you keep us hanging.
was that all these methodologies have challenges, they have limitations, but they can be used, to generate evidence, and that there was need to use mixed methods to be able, to provide stories around, to explain the figures that come with the quantitative data that comes from most of these measurements, and also the aspect of packaging, which is important to have the evidence more accessible to the users.
Thank you. Amazing. Thank you so much, Florence. Shall we go over to Victoria on the communities track?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Corina. I'm going to do justice to the 2 minutes, I hope. In the communities track, the topic today was rethinking agency, and this was key on to how do we measure the shift in agency and power. Looking at what lies underneath resilience measurements, how do we measure it, and who are we measuring for? So a topic of markers and metrics. So we started with a presentation by Aditya from IAD, who really very well outlined all the locally led adaptation principles. I'm not going to read them out because time's taking, but I'll invite you to search for a publication by IAD. I think it has outlined them pretty well. There are about 8 principles that, touch from inclusivity all the way to collaborative action. But the integral part of the conversation was how to operationalize the principles, which now brings the aspect of measurement, and highlighting the various possible ways of measuring the adaptation and LLAs, which range from, you can use guidelines, you can use indicators, metrics, qualities, but very key, and what we focused on in this conversation was using markers. And these markers, what are the right questions, we need to ask, and who need to ask these questions by all the stakeholders, ranging from the providers all the way down the chain through the intermediaries to the recipients, who are mostly the communities. And these questions need to be asked from the planning stage to the implementation all the way to evaluation. And these questions now open up a debate about, what are the key questions that need to be asked about the markers. Do these need to be decision-making tools? Do these need to be, how detailed do they need to be? Do they need to be integrated with monitoring and evaluation systems, and so on? Do they need to be open-ended? Do they need to be a yes or no question? And that kind of opened up a conversation on how to link these markers for locally led adaptation to national objectives or frameworks, because there's a risk of bypassing, what the national and what other policy governing bodies are trying to Oh yeah, sure. So I'm going to really sum up at the last part of the session, where we try to look at some case studies and assumptions that are around, these markers, and these assumptions, kind of try to look at, where do we place the agency of communities, because there have been really conversations, and I think this really is looping from the work we were doing yesterday on the communities track. We need to really shift the hard work from the communities towards giving this work to those people at the positions of powers. And the assumptions that cannot be avoided are assumptions around gender, around what exactly the community needs. Do these, the solutions we're trying to look at, do they reflect the understanding of what the problem is seen in the eyes of the communities? We really need to harness the connections. We need to adopt approaches and terminologies so that we don't lose translation and vocabulary as we try to address the problem. Of course, not to ignore gender assumptions and commonalities of language and diversity. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Victoria. Over to Ariana on urban systems. Is it?
Okay. Hi. Thank you, Karina. So now I have a sense of how long 2.5 minutes is. Not that long. We had a really great session today. We were looking at, it was the WHO session, right? So we were looking at evidence producers and evidence users, and the urban poor as being a central kind of figure in that equation. We had speakers from 2 different NGOs, community-based organizations, the South African SDI Alliance and Mahila Housing Trust. And then we also had the Director of Resilience from the City of Cape Town on our panel. And I think it made for a really interesting discussion, because we really had the different perspectives of the evidence producers and evidence users, with the city with all of them being evidence users, but definitely the city kind of speaking from that perspective. So we talked a lot about the experience that was shared from the South African SDI Alliance was a lot on the really central a tool that's really central to their methodology, which is community-driven data collection. It happens in various different forms, from like really granular household level data to kind of more a bit higher level, but still pretty detailed profiling and mapping, and a lot of firsthand experience of both collecting the data and using that data to engage with municipal and provincial government, and what have been some of the challenges in doing that. And what have been some of the successes. And I think one of the things that really stood out to me about that presentation was, so one of the things that my colleague Charlton said was that currently they're busy collecting data on 170 informal settlements, and which is just under 300,000 people, and that's in Cape Town municipality, and they're busy doing similar work in 9 other municipalities. And one of the things he said was that they're able to do that because they work, so their team, which is some technical professionals from the NGO, but also people who are involved in the community-based process and have been for a number of years and have collected data many times. They work directly with the local communities in the settlements where they're collecting data, which allows them to work at a much larger scale, as I described. So then, I think another piece of the puzzle, and I'm sure I'm coming close to 2.5 minutes. So another piece of the puzzle that I thought was really interesting was the colleague from Mahila Housing Trust spoke a lot about who are we collecting evidence for, and really making sure that the data that we're collecting matches, the needs of the evidence users. Stakeholders like government or research institutions or whoever the stakeholder might be. And that really tied in nicely with some of what the city talked about, which is kind of thank you, what evidence do we need and where are those gaps? And so then the conversation kind of went towards starting to explore and discuss, like, how might we think about bridging those gaps and creating partnerships that are more effective between groups like Mechelen Housing Trust or the South African SDI Alliance and the municipalities where they work and other stakeholders that need this data. And, you know, what the city expressed was that they really do need the data to do their work better, you know, like there was a real feeling of like, we really do need this. And I think that's, since my time is up, I think that that's where I will end. I guess I'll just say that one of the things that did come out, which I think is important to mention, is this issue of trust between, and how central that is in creating effective partnerships. And both, not just the communities trusting the city or whatever the stakeholder is, but the other way around too. And I think kind of tying into a conversation that came up this morning around real meaningful community engagement and partnerships, that element of trust is so central in that from both sides, to make sure that this evidence is used, well, is identified, that it exists, and is used more effectively. Okay.
Thank you, Ariana. I have to say, I am taking this ruthless timekeeping approach inspired by Beth, so that's the role model in timekeeping. Nadia, shall we go over to you?
Sure, thanks. I'm not sure. I did insert a picture because we had the luxury of...
I don't think our slides updated.
Oh.
I think my Wi-Fi was down.
Is this working? It is working. Perfect. Okay, it doesn't matter because we have it up on the wall, so please go and take a little wander past and see all of the rich discussions we've been having over the 1.5 days. This morning, we built on the conversations, built on the what, built on the how, and dug into the who. And I think the benefit of going after others is lots of what has been discussed. We also, you know, the importance of trust, the making sure that we're actually producing knowledge and evidence that is needed, because often we're just producing a whole lot of evidence and it's not necessarily needed by anybody. We had 4 fantastic presentations. They were very, very short. It was remarkable. Most people went under time, which is, I think they were a bit worried about being cut short, but it allowed us to have a lot of time for conversation. So we heard around finance. So what if we're investing in especially activities that are going to build social ecological resilience, what type of evidence do people need? And I think there's a move from not just funding, kind of looking for funding for adaptation, but really thinking about funding mechanisms that fund system-wide change and more systems resilience, and also thinking about non-monetary value. So how do we value social ecological systems in other ways? So bringing that diversity of valuation processes in. We then zoomed right out and then zoomed in and out and looking at satellite data from kind of space to village. So we had a presentation of how do you use satellite data to monitor the impacts of projects or interventions to see how, you can use that type of information to see change, and especially change in terms of kind of increasing, the applications are really, really broad, but especially for seeing how if you just create, I think they're called these half-moon shapes, which increase soil moisture, which have all sorts of other benefits that you can see from space, and that's a real, if you start collecting that type of data, you can track change over time. We had a fantastic example of how do we bring intersectionality into the conversations and into the evidence that we start tracking. And there's a brilliant role-playing game that Zizi introduced and passed out some cards. And it's a really cool tool for you to also use if you're thinking about an intervention, you can't bring diverse stakeholders and you can do some role-playing. And the game really introduces that. So we'll share all these resources online. And then we also had a presentation around nature-based solutions and EBA, thinking about how can you track those, what are the key foundations to make sure that we're thinking about social and ecological components, what is the evidence that can be required for those. We went into some of the challenges. Obviously, we've heard quite a bit about big data sets versus local data sets, production, how it's produced and what is produced versus what's needed. How do we ground truth data? So how do we, accept the data that we see? And then some of the opportunities, I'll be very quick. If you think of all the co's, so just put collaboration, co-create, knowledge co-production, really important to bring people together to think about the types of evidence that they require. And just one thing, asking some of the tough questions early. So don't wait until the end of the project, but start bringing in those really tough questions and potential contestations in the beginning to think about what are the processes and data needs from the beginning.
Thank you so much, Nadia. Over to Michael, last but not least.
Hi, everybody.
on the
Michael
tracks.
Coons with the USAID Center for Resilience. We had a very engaging discussion on market systems resilience. A few takeaways I'd like to share with you. First, strengthening the evidence base is key to scaling up market-based approaches that reach underserved communities with products and services that help people manage the shocks and stresses threatening improvements in their well-being. So a second takeaway is to strengthen the MSR evidence base. It's really important to understand the diverse needs and priorities of evidence producers and users. Here the challenge really is to consider the incentive structures of the different stakeholders to identify what evidence they can contribute, as well as what evidence they need to meet their objectives. The groups of stakeholders that we discussed broadly were the communities, private sector, and policymakers. And to meet the gong deadline, I'm going to skip over what those are, but perhaps they can be discussed following this. Third kind of takeaway is there's a plethora of evidence that MSR approaches can strengthen resilience of individuals, households, and communities. And here the challenge is really collecting, analyzing, and sharing that evidence. And there's an opportunity to apply mixed method approaches using qualitative and quantitative measures to aggregate evidence from the global resilience community. And then fourth, combining traditional and non-traditional data sets or indicators can really promote resilience. So the idea here is there is existing data out there, and it's really, it's kind of an art to put that together and to show how it does contribute to market systems resilience. And we can learn from a lot of different approaches to find ways to strengthen the evidence base. For example, the Center for Development and Innovation has been using indicators of like agency and dignity to inform programming that increased fodder production in Somaliland. Another nice example is Partnership for Risk here in South Africa. Looked at indicators for heat to determine fire risks and storms for floods. And the UNDP has looked at women's empowerment, income generation, and land use as indicators of the existence of buffers against shocks and stresses. And then finally, we think it's really important we see the opportunity to use the existing evidence base and really get knowledge out there about what the opportunities are, as well as strengthen it to advocate for policy changes that strengthen the resilience of market systems, as well as identify opportunities to bring more stakeholders in as contributors to the evidence base.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank
you were 10 seconds over time, but it felt mean to. You were so close. Wonderful. Thank you all. Let's give a big round of applause to our track keynote listeners. And over to you on your tables. What were the key takeaways from the discussions today, from the sessions today, while we swap our keynote listeners? So please turn to a colleague or have a discussion in a small group. What were your key takeaways? Okay, thank you everyone. Can we have your attention back? Wonderful. Thank you so much. We are now going, so if you can imagine, we're now, if we rewind the time, we're now back after lunch and we're about to hear what happened in those cross-cutting sessions. And what was quite interesting is already in some of the tracks takeaways in yesterday's session and in this morning's fireside, already there were a lot of cross-cutting implications. So really looking forward to hearing what happened in the cross-cutting sessions. We do want to mention that there is a difference to what you're seeing on the slides. Alejandro Valencia is stepping in for Asli Kez. Slides didn't update because of the Wi-Fi gods. So shall we go over to Nate, perhaps? Shall we start with you?
Sure. Yeah, so I'm representing the health resilience cross-cutting session that we had. It was excellent. So it was moderated by Nefra Faltis, and co-moderated by me, yours truly, both from USAID. So she's from the Global Health Bureau, and I'm from the Bureau of Health Resilience and Food Security. And we had some excellent participants who spoke on a wide-ranging set of innovations and methodological advancements in resilience health measurement. So we had Dr. Sakif Mustafa from the WHO who spoke about this suite of indicators, this compendium of indicators that he's been developing with them. And then we heard from Dr. Oscar Onam and Dr. Oscar Tapera from UNICEF, who talked about data systems that flex. And we heard from Cougar Hall, who is representing MIHR, which is a USAID activity that is doing a RMS, like a recurrent monitoring system in the DRC, and was talking about how he adapted the Tango method into what they're using for their health resilience monitoring. And then we heard from Nancy Mock, who was representing REAL2 and presenting on this technical guidance note on nutrition. And there were so many fantastic takeaways. I don't think I'll be able to cover all of them within the time limit, and I do want to make sure I get before the bell. But did want to note that I think all of these and what was interesting is they all covered different kind of levels of health systems measurement. I think one thing that health has had, for a long time is kind of the systems level measurement down, but are recently bringing some of these innovations down at the household and community level. So it was really interesting to hear, both the adaptations, but also the expanding on those health systems. So I think a big takeaway is that there's still significant investment that's needed in the developing and testing of these resilience metrics and analytical tools for health. To strengthen global learning and evidence on their value add in advancing health outcomes, but also to advance equity-driven, risk-informed, and shock-responsive programming for health. I think one of the most interesting parts of our discussion came at the very end. We had someone sitting out in our crowd who advanced this really interesting question around making sure that we weren't instituting parallel systems of measurement for data that wouldn't be used, which I think is a common theme across a lot of these sessions. We heard our panelists really respond back with the same as I think we had just heard in the cross-cutting channel from the folks here in Cape Town, but how they were using those data and what was critical, but also the ways that we could prioritize and, diminish some of the other ways that may not be as useful. So yeah, it was a great session. Another interesting and really compelling part of our panel was that all of our contributors agreed to present or work together on a paper to come out of it. So I hope that all of y'all will read that. And yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nate. Shall we go to Kara?
Is this working? Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm representing the conflict cross-cutting track. And I'm just going to really dive into the key themes and takeaways, but I do recommend that you take a look and see who the speakers were, because they were really fantastic, and we had a very engaging dialogue. I think we probably could have stayed another hour with people talking, and it was a really rich discussion. So we talked about the integration of resilience and conflict, and how that, and the different ways that that manifests. One example at USAID is that we're integrating it into our policies and strategies, like our global food security strategy and our resilience policy. But at a more programmatic level, that might mean integrating violence prevention alongside a market systems program. We talked through some examples of projects that are kind of doing that, the integration. Another theme came up was context, and how much context matters in conflict settings, which I think also came up in the urban session that I was part of, but it probably surfaced in a lot of other discussions over the last couple of days. But that how context really drives programming in each place. And we grappled with thinking about what does resilience mean in conflict-affected settings. And just keep in mind that these are settings with multidimensional, often overlapping risks that all have to be considered in real time. But one thing that came up too is just even the definition of conflict-affected settings and how that's itself is variable. And then similarly, when we talked about HDP, so the humanitarian development and peace coherence, we don't have a shared language there either. And in both these cases, we weren't suggesting, I don't think there was a suggestion that we need to have a definition or one shared or definition, but that how we interpret these concepts varies and might even vary depending on the context and the places where we're operating and working. One point that I wanted to raise, though, is that in the discussion around HDP, there could be a consideration, or that we ask the question of how can my intervention bring peace, and that might be something to kind of center the discussions around designs of interventions. We also talked about systems, and that we take a systems approach, often working across multiple systems, and we dug in a little bit around governance in particular, and how we're in conflict-affected settings, we're working in both formal and informal governance systems. And then we also talked about how there are many drivers of conflict, ranging from religion to resources, agricultural, within household, and that sometimes, or maybe even quite often, the loudest conflict gets the most attention. But there are other conflicts happening, and some of them might even be invisible, but they have a lot of spillover effects. And that, even if you can't resolve, in a conflict-affected setting, even if you can't resolve the conflict, you can help people build resilience to that conflict. And I think I'll just stop there.
Thank you, Cara. Shall we go over to Alejo? Yeah, just pass.
Okay, thank you. So my name is Alejandro Valencia. I'm with USAID, and I will be talking about the gender cross-cutting. If anything goes wrong, I'm Asli Kess, so you don't have to worry. So the session was on women's leadership, gender, and inclusivity. Mia Beers opened and moderated. She opened the session by reminding us that development interventions that intentionally focus on empowering women can really deliver significant impacts, and that specifically these interventions that put women at the center have the potential to really increase the resilience of 235 million people, so big numbers, and one of the reasons why we really wanted to have this session be part of the forum. So we had some colleagues from the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI, presenting from CARE International Zimbabwe, from Mercy Corps, also from the World Bank Burundi, and from World Food Program. The conversation really revolved around things like the exposure and sensitivity to shocks, how a resilience capacity, the real opportunities to really make decisions of these people are really gendered. So, all of them had basically worse outcomes for women. It was very interesting to see also the different tools that each of the organizations have built or put together to help us really understand how women are disproportionately burdened when faced with any type of shocks. And so some of these tools are just trying to collect more data that will better inform us where to target, where to invest, where the investment should be prioritized, basically. But also some of these wonderful work that they've been doing on the ground, helping to connect women, things like credit lines for women, encouraging women to take part in collectives, strengthening group dynamics, trying to connect them to financial partners and financial services, and how some of these examples ultimately have been actually introduced to the entire community. So showing again that these types of investment in women can be really improvements to livelihoods in entire communities. And then as a group, I think it was agreed that there's a need for more evidence of impact of resilience interventions on gender equality and women's empowerment. And you guys might have heard this a lot. I know I do in my line of work. And we need sex disaggregated data for monitoring and evaluating the impacts of these interventions. And that, you know, there has been progress, but there's still a lot of work to do. And somebody had a line where they said the power of evidence, and I thought that it was like very nice and touching at the moment, but you had to have been there. Sorry.
That's a catchy pop song in the making, The Power Evidence. Carol, shall we go over to you?
Great, thank you so much. So I was covering the role of agriculture in creating resilient food systems, and we brought together a very diverse panel to provide different perspectives when it comes to agriculture and agriculture-led growth. So we had people from a think tank, seed systems representative, someone representing water, livestock, social ecology, policy, and also the perspective of the farmer. So just to give a bit of evidence, so agriculture can be an incredible means of economic growth. It can be a real driver of growth. And we do know that growth in the agriculture sector can be up to 4 times more effective at reducing extreme poverty than other sectors of the economy. This is a really important factor when we're looking at poverty reduction and resilience of communities. Some of the things, bringing together this very diverse points of view, it made it hard to pull together some key themes. But what I did pull out is we need to meet an increased demand for food. We need to be able to operate under a changing climate, and we do know how agriculture is affected by climate change. We need to provide nutritious and sustainability within the food system. And we also need to consider the cultural components of food because it doesn't operate just within a vacuum. There was a lot of discussion too around the nexus around agriculture and food, the water, land use, energy, and the natural system. How do you come together around all of those different perspectives and really meet that growing demand in food and the growing demand for agriculture? A few things that were brought up, things to be considered, were looking at the farmer and trying to use that bottom-up approach. It was a discussion that we've had that has been resonated throughout this entire event, and it should not be removed from the situation. We need to look at what farmers need, what they want, and then how can we use technology, innovation to be able to meet those needs? How do we provide farmers with information and education to be able to make informed choices about how they grow, what they grow, and when and where. We also need to provide them with that level of sustainability to build those resilient systems. So the challenges in agriculture are extremely complex. Again, climate change, the increased demand for growth, water resources, operating around concerns about biodiversity and operating in a natural environment. So we also have to consider that the solutions to these challenges are going to be extremely complex, and that is going to require a very broad base of individuals to come together around those solutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carol. Over to John, last but not least.
Thank you. So I was with the Sustainable Poverty Escape group. Very rich presentations and discussions. A couple of things that I can highlight. First, we need from the start understand that the universe of beneficiaries that we target is not homogeneous. When you look at time and the threshold, there are households that are occasionally poor, some are persistently poor, some have just graduated from poverty. So the way you target them is different. A household that is occasionally poor can be helped with cash transfer, but that cash transfer may not be efficient for a household that has been persistently poor. So from the start, we need some sort of a typology of where that household is with respect to a given threshold. And of course, that typology will determine what type of interventions are required. And some of the interventions included things like social capital, very important, how is the household connected to his or environment is very important. The issue of human capital around health and education. One thing that came out from, I think, Andrew's presentation was how important prior investment in health was with respect to a shock like COVID. What that says is that you build resilience prior to the shock. You don't wait until it happens and then you start build resilience. And of course, that also means that we need to rethink the way we assess resilience, because we might be investing for long until we can finally evaluate if the resilience investment paid off or not. Another point was that location matters. So we have household characteristics that determine the level of poverty and the type of asset needed to graduate, but also the location characteristics. I think in Zimbabwe, the district that were close to South Africa were much well off compared to other districts just because of the location. So that's very important. Now on graduation, we need to be careful how we determine the threshold for graduation because of the risk of relapse. I think it was in Uganda where graduation was defined within months. That may be a bit problematic, because if a shock happened within 12 months, that household may relapse if not taken care of. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's give it up for all of our keynote listeners, and especially for our cross-cutting session. So before I hand over to my colleague Jesper and we change gear, thank you so much, keynote listeners. Just one key announcement regarding tomorrow. So we know that many of you are checking out tomorrow and heading off tomorrow after we wrap up. Just to give you a sense of the timings, we will be starting sharp at 9 o'clock. There will be breakfast and snacks outside here, so if you are checking out tomorrow, our recommendation is to check out before the start of the sessions, and we will finish the sessions just before 3 o'clock. So we're working to a slightly condensed time frame for tomorrow, because we know that many of you have other travel connections to catch. So please be on time tomorrow morning. We will be starting 9 sharp. And that being said, over to Jesper to change gear and talk about the F word.
The F word. Do I have a clicker or do I just... Oh. Yes. This one? No. Yeah, green one. It is this one. Thank you. Is this on? Yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Jesper Hornberg, and I'm the head of innovation and scaling at GRP. And when I was asked to do this, it felt a little bit like being thrown under a bus, because we're day 2, low energy maybe, and then I have 75 slides to go through, so it's going to be a bit rushed. So you'll just have to bear with me and take pictures if you want. No, on a serious note, it's not 75 slides. It's a bit of an intro to something that we have been working on for the past few years, actually, but recently, the last 9 months, we've done a study on failure, trying to understand what failure is, what causes failure, what drives failure, how do we react to failure. So what I'm going to take you through here is a very brief summary. We will release a report on this in a few months, which will be on the GRP website, among other places, so you can find it there. It's also an invitation to come to us if you want to talk about failure. I mean, we're here to talk about resilience and evidence of resilience. If we want to have those transformative changes that we're all discussing here, we need to be innovative. We need to think about stuff, how we do things, how we collaborate, and that's what we're talking about here. We also need to recognize when something goes wrong, and we want to invite you to work with us on exploring that a little bit more. I will also aim, which is completely impossible to do from stage with you all down there, about 30 meters away, create a safe space, because after this, we're going to go out and we're going to have a bit of a reception, and then we will listen to some people talk about their failures and what they learned about it. We will, after we've heard those people, have open mic, so we invite you to come to either me or Chuchi or Gerald. Could you please stand up and show yourselves? And we will put you on a list, and we will also ask you what failure you're actually going to share, because we don't want to hear everything here. And then you will have the mic, and we will mix that with a bit of break and some drinks and popcorn or whatever it is they're offering out there. Sounds okay? Good. I was also gonna get you going again by having a singing thing and divide you into 3 things, but I told Karina and she said absolutely not. So I'm not doing that. The study we've done, we've looked at literature on failure. There isn't that much out there about adaptation failure yet. Hopefully there will be. But we've done an extensive literature review. We've then interviewed, in-depth interviews with 35 people, some in this room actually, on their attitude and approach to failure. And then we've done a survey as well. So the findings here are from those things. Now, what do those 3 things on the screen have in common? Well, I'm not going to ask you because I don't have time, so sorry for asking. The first one was a mistake in a kitchen in China a long time ago, and a very surprised chef had it blow up in his face. And today we can enjoy fireworks. The middle one, cornflakes, was a mistake in the kitchen and a faulty oven, and it led to not granola as they were planning to, but cornflakes. And the third one is a pacemaker. And the pacemaker was invented by mistake when an inventor trying to invent something else took the wrong circuit and put it in the wrong place. And suddenly he had something that sounded a bit like a heartbeat that could also emit impulses to the heart. So it's pretty good with mistakes, right? Our summary findings, and you won't be able to read these, I'm just going to summarize them briefly for you. We think failure is a necessary part of innovation. Both the literature and the interviews indicate that strongly. And we need to be innovative in order to be transformative, right? We need to do stuff in a new way, which is my way of defining innovation. If we have negative responses to failure, we're likely to limit the leverage that's possible there. The potential to learn something goes away if we're negative. There's a clear conflict, and we found this very clearly in the interviews, between the recognition that failure is something important and the structure that we find ourselves in when we deal with it. More on that in a bit. Unfortunately, and I think this is something that I've heard in several conversations this week, those who hold less power are less able to create structures and processes that work positively with failure. I mean, think about a project. Do they actually report up to the funder that it didn't work out? Those with less power are also less likely to be able to decide what is successful. It's actually, we say, a privilege to be allowed to fail. Failure assumes that we know what the solution is. I never know what the solution is. So I mean, you need to sort of keep a map and track about what it is that you're doing, what you're aiming for, and where you're going, so that you can adjust course as needed. We built the model, and I'll show that on a slide in a bit, which is a bit better than this. But we built a model where we look at the drivers and we look at the responses, and we try to find out what it is that drives our reaction to failure. There is a lot of interest, very clear from the interviews, that people want to have conversations about this. Again, that invitation is open, and it's not going to end. Come to us and talk about failure. A few quotes from the interviews. We have an international NGO representative, sort of quite in an honest way says that in order to get funding in the short term, you need to focus on that, and you don't think about what needs to happen over the long term. And if you want change, you need to probably think long term. There's an M&E manager of a fund, obviously these are anonymous, who said, we have a target failure rate of 40, which is actually much lower than it should be. Someone said that if we fail with less than half of what we do, we are failing at failing enough, because we're not being innovative enough. There is a tendency to only look into what went well and where we have good results. So we talk about those things. We don't dig into what went wrong. And maybe we need to do that in order to adjust course and get it right the next time. A multilateral donor, the word failure brings so much bad attention. You don't want to talk about it. You get questioned about the wrong things. And there is a lot of fear, a lack of a safe space. It's less stigmatized in more innovative sectors. And you can see here on this one that how often does someone who was involved in a failed project get promoted in your sector? And if you look at the NGO, INGO, there is a big chunk that never gets promoted if they're involved in that. If you look at this one, I like this one. What is your estimate? What do you estimate is the failure rate of highly innovative projects? And if you ask government, what the failure rate is, the response is between 0 and 10%. It is quite funny, right? I mean, it's crazy. I think everyone here is quite naive. I think the failure rate is much, much higher for innovative initiatives, projects and companies. It can be a good source of learning. Both the literature indicated that, and I had so many slides on this before, but Corina told me to take them away. And then there's also some examples here. And I want to highlight the one to the right. You got to play the numbers game of failing often, fast, and cheap. Just about 1% of new products actually make it to the market. 1%. So that's a failure rate of 99. Failure can be a pathway to innovative success. And I find this number quite striking. The Dyson vacuum cleaner had 5,126 prototypes. I mean, the dude was really persistent, right? But today we have vacuum cleaners that work because of that. From the interviews, and these are with climate people, adaptation people, funders of climate initiatives. It can be an opportunity to correct. We shouldn't be punishing people when they surface issues. And that's from the UN, so that's good. If we can't have those discussions in our headquarters, how can we expect that countries where people are more or less risking their lives to express their opinions to have them? So it might require a systemic change in how organizations in the money chain approach failure. And this is not a complete money chain, but we might need to address it at several different steps in this chain. I don't know what happened there. Oh, there we go. The literature suggests that in considering failure, it should be framed through consideration of uncertainty, complexity, and power. And you all recognize this. It's really complex what we're trying to do. There is a lack of clear, correct answers because we don't know what it is that we're looking for. We're exploring that. So maybe we need another approach to how, when we discuss what failure is. I know I'm going fast. I'm sorry, guys. It's Karina's fault. Power dynamics are prevalent in resilience work. Who decides? I mean, honestly, who decides? That's a real question. The funders. Yeah. And that's probably right. But maybe building some kind of mechanism into the process where you listen and immerse and so on is useful. Both when planning and when trying to correct course. Failure is when we don't get the outcomes we expected. It doesn't necessarily mean a lack of success. Failure is also a disruption, an invitation to reorient our thinking and a source of insight about what really is going on. Pretty good. So here's the framework that we've developed. There are 4 drivers, the way we look at it. Systemic structures, mental models, cultures. So a culture of where you actually operate, which country, but also culture in the organization. And many of us work across borders and in multilateral organizations, not necessarily the UN, but and we're very international, right? Structures within your organization, and then behavior. Because structures drives processes, drives behavior. There's 3 levels at which drivers can be observed. The organizational, the operational, and the individual. So I'm not giving you a lot of meat here, I know. Read the thing. But Karina, right? But it's a good model. You should read a lot about it. It's a great model. We've modeled 3 archetypes for responses to failure. The top one is the bad one. The bottom one is a much better one, and the middle one is it's okay. It's defensively proactive. You set the goal and you don't reach it because something goes wrong along the way, and you don't adjust course. The other one is that you do something for a while, you readjust course, you sit down and you have a forum about it, and then you reframe the goal maybe, and then you maybe achieve the goal after a while. And the third one is much more dynamic. You set the goal, and then along the journey, you have scheduled sessions for where you talk and open up and create a safe space, a trusting environment to have discussions about what is it that's going on. Let's look at what's going on from this framework here. Let's look at what we're actually trying to achieve long term. What do we need to do short term? And then some suggestions to consider. And again, super summarized. And I almost said Karina again, but I think I might be milking that joke too much. You need to create an environment which is more constructive in its response to failure. You need to get buy-in from those upstream and downstream, and ensuring that the fragile downstream stakeholders are protected, as in the risks that you actually expose them to by doing it. But it's tricky, right? Because you have public opinion, and what do you do with that? Government policy, it follows certain cycles. National and multilateral aid programs, they also follow cycles and agendas, and it's complex, right? Local NGOs, how do they operate? We want to work with them. Project implementers or entrepreneurs, customer or communities. The communities that we want to, and I heard this today, I heard it a few weeks ago at the CBA also in Bangkok. Are we building resilience for local communities or with or by, right? So I think it sort of addresses the same thing. Each stage, you can do things. Resource mobilization, understand the desired risk profile of investment or fund, and if it matches the intended program. So, look at those things. Make sure that there's plenty of learning opportunities and that everyone who is relevant is involved in the learning journey, and document it. I mean, the stuff we're doing here is great because it's part of that. But to look at specific programs and specific projects and actually have honest, safe discussions on those things. This is one of the most true quotes that I have read ever. A company learns when people run experiments that fail, and then they talk about those failures and the lessons they learn. And then you need to do something with it. So if you remember the bottom archetype that I mentioned, you start a project and then you allow stuff to go wrong. You talk about them and you readjust course and you make changes on an individual, operational and organizational level. Or you change the strategy because you rip off the Band-Aid quickly and you move on. Hopefully more than 1% of the projects and programs we're working on will reach market and be successful. But talking about it is the only way to make that happen. You want to know more? Well, keep your eyes open. Find any of the GRP people and we will engage with you. We really want to engage with you. We want to conduct more interviews and we'd like to have you guys as interviewees when having those conversations. We'll continue this journey. How am I doing on time?
Well, 3 minutes.
I don't know what to do with 3 minutes. We're going to go outside soon, as I said, and there's going to be some refreshments and some popcorn, I hope anyway. And then we're going to have 2 presentations, and it's by Christine from USAID. Thank you very much. It takes courage to do this. And then we also have Michael from McCormick, who will share failure experience with us. And then it's open mic. So please have a think about something that you want to share. Not too personal. Don't like dates and stuff. Maybe not. But something from work, something that you learned from, or that you saw that someone else learned something from. Yeah, and for the online audience, this will not be broadcasted. I released them? You are released, Karina says. Thank you.
The motherland that brought us far is the one we talk about. No matter where you end up, trust